classical apologetics, you start by proving God exists, and then you go to step 2, which is proving the evidence of Christianity, right? So step 1 would be prove God exists. Step 2 is show through evidence. Now that's the 2-step approach. If you're just going to do the 1-step apologetic, you're just working with somebody and assuming that they'll accept God exists, and you go straight into the evidence. And even they'll go so far as to say you don't need to prove God exists philosophically because the evidence for Jesus Christ is strong enough that just proving that Jesus was resurrected is enough to prove that God exists and that Christianity is true. So to that purpose, we have the 1-step, which is the classical apologetics, and the 1-step approach, which is evidential apologetics. So for evidential, you just skip step 1 and go straight to step 2. And now we're going to examine the historical, the central evidence for Christianity, and that really does center on the resurrection of Jesus. There are books out there that are 700 plus pages long, where people work through all of the evidence and all the proofs and all the theological consequence of the resurrection. And that's important because for our faith, the resurrection has the theological reasoning behind the resurrection has a lot of bearing on how we live now and how we treat people and what we're willing to die for. But then when we look at the historical evidence for the resurrection, that gives us a lot of confidence in its truth and that it actually happened. But those are two different things. The historical claim and the theological claims are two separate facts about the resurrection. But they both are true, and they both have bearing on our lives today. But what we're going to look at is the historical evidence. So our central evidence for Christianity is that of the resurrection. There is a gentleman named Thomas Arnold, and I believe he was a professor at Oxford University. And he said, "I have been used for many years to study the histories of other times and to examine the weight of evidence of those who have written about them. And I know of no one fact of the history of mankind which is proved by better and fuller evidence of every sort to the understanding of a fair inquirer than the great sign which God hath given us, that Christ died, that he rose again from the dead." So this is a Ivy League professor. He's done a lifetime of historical research. And his point here is that the most sure thing in history that we have is that Christ died and that he rose again from the dead. The amount of historical evidence we have for Christ is really unparalleled from any point in history up until basically the invention of the computer. Now with so much video and the easy propagation of materials with the internet, we do have a lot of information about people today, like Donald Trump or Pol Pot or Mao Zedong currently. But for anyone historically before the 1800s, nobody has the amount of historical evidence as Jesus Christ. He is on the same level as Emperor Octavian, and the historical evidence for Jesus Christ far exceeds anything we have that points to someone like Alexander the Great. So what we have is an embarrassment of riches that proves who Jesus was or who Jesus is and what he did on this earth. So our central claim is that Christianity is true. So Christianity rises and falls on the truth of the resurrection. Paul said it this way: "If Christ be not risen, then is our preaching vain, and your faith is also vain." So Paul in particular was not especially concerned even with proving that Jesus lived, because that was an undisputed claim in their day. And for the atheists today who try and deny that Jesus lived, even we've talked a few times about Bart Ehrman. He's one of the best, most well-known atheist skeptics who's also a scholar. And he goes and he really talks down to people who assume that Jesus never lived. He mocks them and says that there is no better historical claim than that Jesus lived and that he died. He accepts those things on their historical basis. But what he denies is the reality of the resurrection. So what he'll do is Bart Ehrman, and many other skeptics, will go to these 4 different explanations for why we know the resurrection didn't happen. And they come up with these theories and try to undermine the historical claim of the resurrection of Jesus Christ. So first of all, we have the swoon theory. The idea is Jesus Christ died on a Roman cross. That is a historically valid fact. But he didn't actually die when he was up there. Instead, he was under such grievous medical injuries. He had gone through so much trauma that he passed out. He was in a swoon on the cross. Maybe his heart rate was reduced so much that people couldn't see any sign of a pulse, no breathing, and they just looked at him on the cross and assumed he was dead. And in such a rush for the Jews to get the bodies off the cross before the Passover, they took him off prematurely and went and laid him in this cool cave where he was able to rest and have some respite from the trauma of his wounds and injuries, and he was revived while he was laying in the cool of the cave. For someone who's in traumatic shock, they say you should always carry an emergency blanket so that if it's less than 95 degrees outside, you can wrap them in the blanket to help prevent them from going into shock. Because if they go into shock, then they will probably die. According to Jewish law, someone could only be whipped 39 times. Paul that happened to him three different occasions where he was whipped 2 score save 1. That would be 39 stripes that Paul underwent. But for the Roman scourging that happened under Pilate, that scourging was not limited in the same way. And if we're going to believe things like the evidence for the Shroud of Turin being legitimate, that has evidence that there were more than 300 stripes on this crucified man. Whether or not that is Jesus, we don't know for sure. But if it is Jesus, he would have had more than 300 stripes. There's very good reason to believe that it was much more than the typical 39 stripes that the Jews would have done. So we're talking about traumatic bleeding. The cat of nine tails had pieces of bone, metal, and glass woven into the different strands on the whip. And so for every whip, you're getting 9 stripes. And with the pieces of metal and glass, history tells us that it was ripping the skin and the muscle away to the point where you could see exposed blood vessels and bone in the people who had their backs whipped with these Roman cat of nine tails. So even just the scourging itself is enough to kill most people. So the fact that people want to say Jesus got whipped so terribly and then woke up from a swoon, that's really not a very provable fact. You also have the point James brought up. For a Roman executioner, if they were supposed to make sure someone was dead and then they were not dead, their life was forfeit. So it's the same thing as if they're sent to guard a prisoner and the prisoner gets away, well then the Roman guard dies. Same thing happened for Roman executioners. You're supposed to kill somebody and then they don't die, you die in their place. So these guards would have had a really good reason to make sure that he was dead. And the group that would have been tasked with this would have been what they call a quaternium. So it's 4 different Roman soldiers that are underneath a centurion. Those 4 Roman soldiers would be in charge of the execution process. And then the centurion, the book of Mark records, when the centurion goes and gives the direct report to Pilate that Jesus Christ was dead. So we have really good historical reason to believe that he didn't just swoon, he really did die. The next theory we have here is the theft theory. The idea being that this is the one that the Pharisees put forward, that when Jesus was executed, they buried him in the tomb, and then the disciples came later and stole the body to make sure that the guy was in there. And then when they put the seal over the door, they know that the door could not have been opened by anyone else, right? So when the tomb was sealed, it wasn't just putting the rock in front of the door. they actually put a seal on it so they could tell if the seal was broken when the door opened. And that seal was not broken until sometime between late Saturday night and early Saturday or Sunday morning. Between, if you believe in a Wednesday or a Thursday crucifixion, between the crucifixion and his burial, all the way up until the resurrection, nobody opened that tomb. Well, what about the wrong tomb theory? This kind of fits together with the theft theory. People say, well, maybe they went to the wrong tomb. They went to check if Jesus was there, and it was empty because the ladies going on Sunday morning, women aren't great with directions. They just got lost. They went to the wrong tomb. And if they went to the wrong tomb, wouldn't the Pharisees have just gone, what are you guys talking about Jesus Christ for? We have his body. It's in the sealed tomb. Yeah, so the wrong tomb theory doesn't make a lot of sense. What about the hallucination theory? This is that basically when the different witnesses saw Jesus, they were in so much grief that they were having these visions. You've talked to the old widow who, thinks she sees her husband sitting on the chair across the room, and then she looks up a second later and he's gone. Well, maybe Jesus wasn't resurrected. Maybe they're having these hallucinations. And maybe it was so much to the point that when Jesus appeared in his resurrected body before all the apostles on the beach and ate fish with them, or when he appeared to them in the upper room, well, maybe these appearances were actually while the disciples were on mushrooms. And they were just all having like a group trip on these drugs. Would that explain the proof that we have for the resurrection? Okay, so in the book of Acts, the Sanhedrin gathers to talk about what they're going to do about this new Christian movement. Why didn't they just go and produce the body if all the apostles were having these psychotic trips? They had the body. If Jesus was still dead, they would have had the body, right? So they could have just gone and produced the body. The same problem with the wrong tomb theory. Instead of freaking out, oh no, how do we know whether or not this movement is from God? How do we stop these Christians? The way you stop it is you say that the guy that they claim is not dead is actually dead. That's easy to do if you have the body, but they did not have the body. So the wrong tomb theory does not hold a lot of water. We have already kind of touched on. For those of you who are not familiar, this in the top corner of the picture, that is the Shroud of Turin. And you can't see it well here, but if you mess with the coloration, you can see the picture of a man on the shroud. And when you examine the cloth itself, you can see blood stains, and actually they've done DNA tests on the blood, and they know some things about what kind of blood type the man of the shroud had, and some different causes of death based on the condition of the hemoglobin in those cells. So there's really cool evidence on the shroud that is helpful. But this bottom picture is a sculpture that somebody made based on the image that is on the shroud. And so they reproduced where every mark from the whips were. They reproduced the place where he would have had the hole in his side and the holes in his hands. Now, when we look at the evidence, we see that someone who went through what Jesus did, and the very likely evidence is that Jesus probably had over 300 stripes from these Roman scourges, and even the process of being nailed to a cross would have caused things like suffocation, exposure to the elements, reduced blood to both the brain and the stomach. So there would have been a lot of ways where we have good reason to believe that the ordeal he went through would have killed him. Along with that, when you read the gospel accounts and it describes when the centurion thrust the spear into his side, we're talking about a spear piercing through his right side, going through his right lung, piercing the pericardial sac, and stabbing him in the heart. And that's why when the centurion pulled the spear out, that's why there was blood mixed with water. Blood and water separate. If you have the heart rupture, then the blood and the water separate. The water fills that pericardial sac, and the blood would stagnate in the heart, and then it would all come out upon being stabbed by the centurion. So there's very good reason to believe that Jesus essentially died of a broken heart from a heart rupture while he was hanging on the cross. We also have Pilate's 4 executioners that would have been there, plus the centurion. Their lives would be forfeit if Jesus did not actually die, which is one reason we have great evidence to prove that Jesus really did die. This will be our last slide. We're going to have to wrap up due to time. But when Jesus died, he was buried by his friends. There would have been no reason for them to desecrate or to lose his body. They would have allies who buried him, and the allies could verify Jesus' crucifixion, right? He really was dead. And if he were to start coming out of his swoon, they would have done everything that they could to preserve his life and take care of him. But instead, all they did was wipe his body clean, wrap him in these cloths and spices, and lay him in a tomb. Additionally, the tomb was very expensive, so it wouldn't make a lot of sense to put someone you value in there unless it was actually legitimately someone who was dead that you wanted to honor. And then lastly, we have the verification from Jesus' enemies. The Romans and the Jewish leaders had Jesus sealed in a tomb, and they put a Roman guard on it. Well, if they're going to seal the tomb that's containing the body of their greatest enemy, they're going to make sure his body's in there, right? They're going to make sure it's the right tomb. And so we have not just the verification from his friends that he had actually died, but we have the verification of enemies that Jesus' body really was in that tomb when it was sealed.